Hello and welcome to More to the Story with Molly White. I'm so glad you joined me again today for another great episode of us exposing or telling you what the abortion industry doesn't want you to know. And so we're going to be talking about a couple of Supreme Court cases with just me and Mary today. We don't have any guests, but we have, these two important cases that we need to discuss and educate you on. And so before I get started, I always want to give a shout out to our show sponsor, Dr. Stephen Hotze with the Hotze Health and Wellness Center. We're very grateful for his sponsorship. And just a reminder to pray for him and his family. He lost his beloved wife and just had her funeral just not too long ago, and he has a large family, and I know they're grieving her loss, and as well as the whole entire medical staff. So just please keep them in prayer. And we also want to thank those who give to us, monthly little donations. We're very grateful for that. It really goes a long way to help us get this podcast going. And now I'd like to introduce my partner, my co-host, my friend, Mary Browning.
Good morning, Molly. It's so good to be on the show. And I'm glad you thought to do this to talk about a couple of Supreme Court cases that recently come out. It's very important.
It is very important. And so, I don't know if we need a disclaimer. We're really not going into a lot of information about abortion. But sometimes anytime even the word abortion comes up, women get triggered. So do you want to give them a disclaimer real quick?
That's a good point, Molly. Yes, we will be. Some of the topic that we'll be talking about does include abortion. And if you have abortion in your past, or you've helped someone obtain an abortion, or if you have a child that was aborted even against your will, we want you to know that if you can have an emotional reaction sometimes with a conversation. If that happens for you today, we consider that a trigger, and it's just an invitation to another level of healing. So we invite you to that. You can find that at the H3 helpline or at operationoutcry.org. The H3 helpline is 866-721-7881, and you can get a live coach with that number that has abortion experience and can help you connect with an abortion recovery program. And you can also find abortion recovery resources at operationoutcry.org. Thank you, Molly.
Well, thank you, Mary, because it is, our heart for those who've had abortions to go through healing and recovery and be set free from all that pain and trauma that follows. So thank you. So let's talk about the Medina case, Mary. It came down, was it yesterday or the day before? And so let's give our viewers and our listeners a little bit of information about that case and then talk about the implications of it.
Thank you. Yes, that case started in the state of Tennessee when the Tennessee governor back in July of 2018.
South Carolina.
I'm sorry. The Medina case was South Carolina. Thank you, Molly.
I have my notes right here or something. Okay, wait a minute.
In July of 2018, the governor of South Carolina issued an executive order that considered that Planned Parenthood was not a qualified medical provider for the Medicaid program because they mainly did abortions, and they didn't consider that medical care. So the Planned Parenthood sued South Carolina because they wanted to continue to receive Medicaid and taxpayer funding for the abortions they provided. So the U.S. Supreme Court, it was just yesterday, determined that Tennessee's law would be enforceable and upheld. Tennessee could make the decision, and they would not be forced to pay Planned Parenthood as a qualified medical provider.
Which that is such good news, because I know many states have tried this or been wanting to defund them. And so that is really, really good yesterday. I'm going to read what came out of Life. Let's see, it came from United for Life. I want to read what they posted, if I can find my article again, that the ruling means, of course, like you said, that South Carolina can defund Planned Parenthood and other abortion businesses deemed that are unqualified to receive Medicaid reimbursement. And they also wrote about, that that Planned Parenthood gets $2 million in taxpayer dollars a day, which totals about $792.2 million per year. And so, Mary, you and I were talking before the show. What does that mean? How does that funding come about?
Well, that's a good question, Molly. And I know that in order to, it's called drawdown. In order for a state to draw down federal Medicaid dollars, the state has to have so much of their own taxpayer dollars to draw to. So the Medicaid program is a combination of state tax dollars and federal tax dollars. So what South Carolina did when they said, no, you're not a qualified medical provider, we really don't want taxpayer dollars going to fund you. And the Supreme Court said, that's okay. You can make that decision as a state. You can make that decision, no taxpayer dollars. So that would be for the $2 million a day that you mentioned, that would be South Carolina's now would be cut out of that because they're not required to pay Planned Parenthood.
Awesome. And so I can imagine that all the pro life states that we have, 12, 13 of them or more, they're going to follow suit. I have no doubt they're going to follow suit because I know there's been many states who did not want to defund or fund Planned Parenthood for the same reason South Carolina didn't. They're not a medical provider. They do not provide a medical service, only abortion, birth control, and some other things that we're going to talk about here in a little bit.
Mhm. Yes. Well, I know from years ago when I worked for the state in Missouri, that was one of the questions. We really felt like we had to provide abortions because at the federal level, it was determined that abortion was in the Constitution at that point. And
Right.
so the state was required to find a way to fund, even when the Missouri taxpayers did not want any of their dollars going to abortions. So it's interesting now to be in this place where today our Supreme Court has said, yes, people can decide whether or not how to spend their taxpayer dollars. The Congress does not bind their hands on this issue to force taxpayer dollars to go to Planned Parenthood.
And this is such good news. It's good news for you and me and so many others in the pro life world, and even regular taxpayers who don't want to fund killing babies through abortion. Goes against our moral and our human values, to a large degree. So this is really, really good news. And we've talked about on our show many times that abortion is not health care. It does not save the life of the mother. Pregnancy is not a disease. And so
Mhm.
it doesn't even really fall in the line or under the definition of health care. And so defunding them is not only helping, women, period, but I lost my train of thought. It keeps Planned Parenthood from having extra money to use for other purposes.
That's exactly what I was just thinking, Molly. In an earlier program, we talked about the New York Times article on the front page where workers of Planned Parenthood were coming forward saying how abysmal their clinic or their center circumstances were because the dollars, the millions and millions of dollars that Planned Parenthood was getting didn't go to provide any of the services they provided. And I think one of the things that struck out to me in that article was the 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 pads that you lay on the bed for each different person that came in. They were using those to try to keep the sewage from backing up into the exam room. They were stuffing those at the bottom of the door, and the stench had to be horrible. And I hate to think what was blocking the sewage at that center. But when you say, it really begs the question: what is all that money being used for that Planned Parenthood is getting? We can talk about the 700 million taxpayer dollars, but Planned Parenthood is a nonprofit, so they are getting lots of other dollars too. But they're using those to fight pro-life laws in different states and to fight and to move forward agendas that are not the majority of what the majority of the citizens in our country would want.
Absolutely. South Carolina is an example of that. They've
Yeah.
used that money to, sue South Carolina. That's just a recent case. They've used that money to support pro-abortion candidates running for office. They've
Yes.
used that money to push, like in Missouri this past election. They pushed it as abortion and all this as a constitutional amendment instead of going through the legislative process. They use
Yes.
because they know they can't get their bills passed in legislation or through the legislative process. So they go through the courts and they go through other means to try to push their radical abortion agenda using, and I know I don't have the figure right offhand, but I know I've testified on this before, but they make over $1 billion a year for a nonprofit organization. And they pay their executives hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So it's really a good thing that the Supreme Court ruled justly in this case. At least our
Yes.
taxpayer dollars in many states won't be going to fund abortion providers. So let's kind of shift from Planned Parenthood is not a medical provider. Their number one goal is to keep women from having children, and so abortion is their biggest profit maker. Birth control, STD testing, but now they're into another big money making business. Let's talk about that, Mary.
Yes, and Molly, as we know, there's been a real push across our country on the transgender and to transition even minors to a different gender than what they were born as. And what we've learned is that Planned Parenthood is also one of the big funders and the promoters of this ideology that you can choose your own gender. But if you don't like the gender that you were born as, you can go through the process of having surgery and chemicals and change that. And so they're so included in their agenda, the Planned Parenthood agenda, to manage birth by eliminating the child in the womb. They also are giving their behind teaching children that they can change their own gender and then funding the process to do that.
Are they funding it? Or are they performing those services as well? Are
I
they
think
giving them the puberty blocking drugs? Are they giving them the chemicals, the drugs to start that process?
it is my understanding that they are the most prevalent provider of those types of services.
Absolutely. And it just boils down to the fact for me, Mary, that Planned Parenthood started from the very get go as a eugenist based organization. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, her desire was to get rid of a certain race. And that was the race of, the black race and poor people. That was her goal. And she developed a birth control pill. That didn't work. They created abortion, and it stemmed from that. But the whole basis of the Planned Parent ideology is to keep people from having children. It's a depopulation mindset that they
Yes.
have. And when you transition from male to female, female to male, you become sterile. You're never able to have children. And so to me, those two things tie together, either birth control, abortion, sterilization, or transgender to meet the goals of Planned Parenthood. And that's from my personal perspective. But if you look at it and the services that they provide and the things that they promote and do, it's all about sterility. It's all about infertility. It's all about keeping women and men from reproducing. That's my soapbox.
Well, and Molly, there's another U.S. Supreme Court decision that came down last week. That was on Wednesday, June 18th, and that's the Skermeti case. And in that case, Tennessee had passed a law that said you couldn't give transition treatments, meaning chemicals and whatnot, or surgeries to minors. And there were three sets of parents that challenged the Tennessee law to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said no. This transgender transitioning has got a lot of downsides, and in that opinion, the Supreme Court cited other countries who are a little further along this path than the U.S. has been, and they are seeing more of the backlash, more of the people that have transitioned, that have committed suicide, that can't undo it, that have regrets, that feel like they were sort of manipulated or exploited as a minor, and they should
Yes,
not have been allowed to transition. So I think this our Supreme Court was wise again in finding, number one, that the elected officials in Tennessee had every right to put restrictions on this experimental process of transitioning from one gender to another, and that it really that was more important to not force those procedures, and that again would be more than likely could be taxpayer funded as well. So,
absolutely. And it's
mhm,
really protecting minor children, and
yeah,
that's really what we're called to do, is protect minors. And I know, the abortion industry, and we've had people on our show talking about this, how doctors and even psychologists, psychiatrists, if a parent or parents take their child in, and the child is having some gender dysphoria, thinking they're the opposite sex, and they say, oh, if you don't let this child transition, the child's going to commit suicide. Well, of course, it scares the parents to death. And I think Elon Musk was one of those. It happened to his son. And of course, his son committed suicide. But it's, it's, you know, protecting minors from predatory practices, if you ask me, you know.
well, and even themselves, I think some of the statistics are, as the Supreme Court quoted, that there's uh, uh, a lot there's a lot of evidence that some young people might go through some of that gender dysphoria, but if you just let it resolve itself, they
Right,
often grow out of that.
right,
And
right.
so if you catch them in that bad place, and then put them in that rut where they can never get out,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And
Yeah.
so I
And
think
it does
that,
more irreversible harm than it does good in the long run.
yes.
I was just took a note here when you were speaking about, some of the health issues. These are lifetime health
Mhm.
issues that
Yes.
that women and men, boys or girls, when they go through the transition process, it causes lifetime serious
Mhm.
medical problems. And I've heard
Mhm.
testimonies of those who are detransitioning, and the severity of those health problems is outlandish. It's just criminal. It's cruel
Yes.
to
Mhm.
even allow especially minors to go through this kind of procedure. If you're an adult and want to do it and want to take on those risks, at least you're going in there with the mindset or the mental capacity to understand the risks that are involved. But as a minor, you do not. And so that's it. Go ahead. That was another great
Well,
ruling from the Supreme
I was
Court.
just talking to someone recently who'd had an abortion as a minor and had really wished she had had the benefit of her mother's brain. And the way the way she described it was, my brain was not fully developed. I really needed that that fully developed brain of my mother to help guide me through that decision making. And so, just as you were saying that, it dawned on me. Well, people may be confused, but that doesn't mean we lock them into part of that confusion.
That's right. A proper
Mhm,
healthcare provider will help you work through that confusion,
mhm,
take you through the steps, take you through the process, give you the time and the resources you need to work through it, not just pounce on it,
mhm.
and say
Yes.
there's no other way. You got to transition to make you happy, and
Mhm.
that's I've got a degree in psychology, and I don't have a master's or a doctorate, but I've learned enough that you know you, we're supposed to help people work through these issues,
Yes.
not to pounce on a problem and say there's no help, there's no recovery from this, you have to
Right.
do it this way. So that's a very good ruling. um, and it just brings me back to the fact that the abortion industry, and Planned Parenthood is the leader of the abortion industry. They really do not care about the long term effects of what they provide on their patients. They really don't care, of the outcome of these dangerous things that they do. The birth control, we had our guest on this earlier this week. You know,
Yes.
and we're going to have a podcast talking about the different birth control methods and the severe health consequences from taking these, from birth control to sterilizing to abortion to transgendering. All of these things have negative health consequences on people, and Planned Parenthood and other abortion providers could care less. As long as you just go to them and give them your money, after that, you're not their problem anymore. And they're just leaving in its wake a huge amount of suffering people. That's my opinion. That's what I've witnessed. That's what I've witnessed in my 26 years of doing this, you know.
Well, and Molly, as we've talked today about a couple of U.S. Supreme Court cases, I just would encourage our listeners to familiarize themselves with these cases. One is the Medina case out of South Carolina. The other is the Skermeti case out of Tennessee. And we are at the end of the U.S. Supreme Court term for this session, and there were 5 more opinions issued today, which we haven't had a chance to examine yet. The court is getting ready to go on recess where they won't be sitting on the bench on a regular basis now again until October 1. And so if these decisions do have an impact on us, we know it's the Roe v. Wade that said there was abortion in the Constitution and that we lived under that for almost 50 years. So now it seems like we're getting more balance in terms of what is appropriate public policy for our nation. And so we just encourage our readers to familiarize yourselves with those opinions.
Absolutely. And it's been because of the work of countless pro-life groups out there, pro-life legislators, just been the result and the of the hard work that's been put in to making these necessary balanced and
Yes.
logical changes in our laws. And so we want to commend everyone out there who's,
Yeah.
been involved in pro-life work and who's gone and testified and educated and worked to end, this scourge in our country and to bring common sense back into the courts and back into our laws. So we want to commend y'all for that. Well, Mary, I think we're going to be out of time for today. We just wanted to
Yes.
come in and talk about these 2 cases. Thank you, Mary, for joining me, and thank you all for tuning in to More to the Story with Molly White. We're going to have a name change coming up, so look forward to that. And we will see you again next time. Have a great weekend.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Mary.
Sure. Thank you, Molly.
Bye bye.